It was one of those evenings where the sky seemed to stretch endlessly, painted in shades of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air carried a slight chill, but it wasn't enough to make anyone think twice about heading home after a long day. In her car, a woman sat behind the wheel, gripping it lightly as she navigated through the quiet streets of downtown Chicago. Her mind wandered partly on the case she'd been working on all day at the courthouse, partly on what she might cook for dinner when she finally got home. She had spent years building her career, rising through the ranks to become a respected state lawyer. Known for taking on tough civil rights cases, she had earned a reputation not just as someone who fought hard in court, but as someone who genuinely cared about fairness. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, she was just another driver, trying to get home safely. As she turned onto a quieter street, something caught her eye in the rearview mirror, a pair of flashing blue lights. At first, she felt confused. Was she speeding? Had she missed a stop sign or rolled past a red light without realizing it? She slowed down and pulled over carefully, making sure to signal before coming to a complete stop. There was no reason to panic. Traffic stops happened every day. She figured this would be quick. Maybe a warning or a small fine if she'd made a mistake. The officer stepped out of his patrol car and walked toward hers, his boots clicking against the pavement. He knocked on her window, and she rolled it down with a polite smile, ready to explain herself. "License and registration, please," he said brusquely, his tone sharp enough to catch her off guard. "Of course," she replied calmly, reaching into her bag for her license and then leaning over to grab the registration from the glove compartment. As she handed them over, she decided to clarify things. "I'm sorry if I was going too fast. I've had a really long day and I guess I wasn't paying attention." Instead of softening, the officer's expression hardened. His voice grew louder, almost accusatory. "Do you know how dangerous it is to speed through residential areas? You could have hurt someone." Her heart sank. This didn't feel right. She hadn't been speeding, not recklessly anyway. Maybe she was a little tired, but nothing more than that. Still, she nodded and apologized again, hoping to defuse the situation. "You're absolutely right. I'll be more careful next time." But the tension only escalated. Another squad car pulled up behind them, its lights adding to the growing sense of unease. More officers approached, their presence overwhelming. One of them started questioning her further, asking why she seemed so defensive, why she kept glancing at her phone. Every attempt to explain herself seemed to fall flat. They weren't listening. Things spiraled quickly. When she reached for her phone to call her husband, hoping to let him know what was happening, one of the officers barked, "Keep your hands where we can see them." Startled, she froze, unsure of what to do next. Before she could react, they were pulling her out of the car, twisting her arms behind her back, and snapping handcuffs around her wrists. Pain shot through her shoulders as she stumbled onto the cold pavement. The world around her blurred flashing lights, muffled voices, and the sound of her own breathing, ragged and uneven. She tried to speak, to tell them who she was, but her words barely registered. "I'm a state lawyer. Please check my ID." "This is a misunderstanding." No one listened. Instead, they began searching her car, rifling through papers and personal belongings. She watched helplessly, her chest tightening with each passing second. How had this happened? Just moments ago, she'd been an ordinary person driving home, and now she was lying face down on the ground, surrounded by strangers accusing her of something she didn't do. What made it worse was the realization creeping into her mind that this wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't just a random mix-up. This was bigger than her. Bystanders had gathered, some filming the scene on their phones. Their eyes told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it likely wouldn't be the last. As the minutes dragged on, her thoughts raced. She thought about her job, about the countless hours she'd spent defending people who couldn't defend themselves. She thought about the speeches she'd given, the reforms she'd pushed for. All of it felt meaningless now, swallowed up by the weight of this moment. For the first time in years, she felt powerless, and yet, deep down, a spark of determination flickered inside her. If there was one thing she knew how to do, it was fight. Even as the cuffs dug into her skin and the accusations flew around her, she promised herself one thing: this wouldn't end here. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on, and she wouldn't stop until justice was served. The night grew colder as the officers continued their search of her car. Each movement they made felt deliberate, almost theatrical, like they were trying to justify their actions even though nothing seemed out of place. The woman lay on the ground, her cheek pressed against the rough asphalt, her breath visible in the chilly air. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't voice aloud. Why weren't they listening? Why did this feel so personal? One officer held up her phone, scrolling through it without permission. "What's this?" he asked sharply, holding up a text message conversation. It was nothing incriminating, just a casual chat with her husband about what to pick up for dinner, but she didn't get the chance to explain. Another officer barked over him, accusing her of being uncooperative and resisting arrest. The words stung. She hadn't resisted anything. All she'd done was try to follow their commands while pleading her innocence. The crowd around them had grown larger. Some people whispered among themselves, others filmed silently, their phones capturing every moment of humiliation. A few shouted questions at the officers, demanding to know why she was being treated this way. Their voices blended into the chaos, making it hard to focus. She tried to block it all out, focusing instead on staying calm. But inside, her emotions churned, a mix of anger, confusion, and fear bubbling just beneath the surface. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers yanked her to her feet. Her legs wobbled under her weight, stiff from lying on the cold ground for so long. They marched her toward their patrol car, shoving her into the back seat with more force than necessary. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her off from the world outside. For a brief second, she thought about screaming, about demanding answers or yelling for help. But what good would that do? No one here seemed interested in hearing her side of the story. As the car pulled away from the scene, she stared out the window, watching the flashing lights fade into the distance. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't change anything. Instead, she clenched her fists tightly, feeling the metal of the handcuffs dig into her skin. This wasn't how her day was supposed to end. Not after everything she'd worked for. Not after all the battles she'd fought to make things better for others. At the precinct, things only got worse. They led her inside, past rows of desks where other officers glanced up briefly before returning to their work. No one stepped forward to ask what was going on. No one questioned whether she belonged there. To them, she was just another person in handcuffs, another faceless suspect dragged in off the street. They took her to a small, dimly lit room and sat her down at a table. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the walls. An officer stood nearby, arms crossed, glaring at her as if waiting for her to crack. "You think you're smart, huh?" he said, leaning closer. "Acting like you're above the law." She blinked at him, stunned. Above the law? That was the last thing she'd ever claimed to be. In fact, she spent most of her life working within the law, fighting to hold people accountable, including those who abused their power. But none of that mattered now. Here, in this tiny room, she was just another statistic, another black person caught in a system designed to see guilt before innocence. Hours passed, though it was hard to tell exactly how many. Time blurred together as she sat there, ignored by everyone except when someone came in to bark more questions at her. She answered each one truthfully, explaining again and again that she was a state lawyer, that there must be some kind of mistake. But her words fell on deaf ears. Eventually, exhaustion set in. Her body ached from sitting in the same position for so long, and her throat felt dry from talking or maybe from swallowing her frustration. Still, she refused to give up. Every time they dismissed her, every time they acted like she wasn't worth listening to, she reminded herself why she did what she did. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone else who had faced something similar and walked away feeling powerless. By the time morning rolled around, news of her arrest had spread far beyond the confines of the precinct. Someone in the crowd the previous night had posted a video online, and it had gone viral almost instantly. Social media lit up with outrage as people recognized her face from interviews and court appearances. Comments poured in, calling for justice and accountability. Hashtags began trending nationwide, drawing attention to the systemic issues that allowed situations like this to happen. Back at the station, the officers finally realized who she was, or rather, who she claimed to be. One of them muttered something about checking her credentials, and soon enough her identity was confirmed. She watched as their demeanor shifted, their earlier hostility melting into awkward discomfort. Someone uncuffed her hands, muttering an apology that sounded more like an excuse than genuine remorse. When she stepped outside the precinct later that afternoon, cameras flashed in her face, reporters shouting questions left and right. She paused, for a moment, taking a deep breath before addressing the crowd. Her voice trembled slightly, but she spoke with conviction. "This isn't about me," she said firmly. "It's about every person whose voice has been silenced because of their race. I will not stand idly by while injustice prevails." Her words resonated deeply, sparking conversations across the country about bias in policing and the urgent need for reform. Though physically free, she knew the fight was far from over. As she walked away from the cameras and microphones, surrounded by supporters offering hugs and words of encouragement, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. What had started as a nightmare was now fuel for the fire driving her forward. If this experience could shine a light on the flaws in the system, then perhaps it wasn't entirely in vain. But as she climbed into a friend's car and settled into the passenger seat, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Her hands shook as she wiped away tears she'd been holding back for hours. The weight of the previous night hit her all at once, the fear, the anger, the sheer disbelief that this had happened to her. Yet amidst the pain there was also determination. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance, she was a fighter. And she knew, without a doubt, that she would keep fighting not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved better. By the time she left the precinct, the world outside felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with a mix of anger and disbelief. People were talking everywhere. Social media was ablaze with reactions to her arrest. Videos of the incident had spread like wildfire, capturing not just the moment itself, but the raw emotion behind it. Her face, usually seen in courtrooms or on news panels discussing justice reform, was now plastered across screens nationwide. This wasn't how she imagined becoming a trending topic. Reporters swarmed around her as she stepped out into the daylight, their questions rapid-fire and relentless. "What happened last night? Do you feel targeted because of your race? Are you pressing charges against the officers?" Each question hit her like a wave, one after another, leaving little room to breathe. She raised a hand to signal for calm, her voice steady despite the storm swirling inside her. "This isn't about me," she began, pausing to collect her thoughts. Her eyes scanned the crowd, locking onto faces that reflected both curiosity and concern. "This is about every person who has ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. What happened to me last night happens to countless others every single day. The only difference is I have a platform to speak up, and I intend to use it." Her words struck a chord. Heads nodded in agreement, phones captured her statement, and social media erupted once again. Hashtags like #JusticeForHer and #EndRacialProfiling dominated timelines. People shared stories of their own run-ins with law enforcement, tales of being pulled over without cause, detained without explanation, or worse. It was as if her experience had opened a floodgate, giving voice to those who had long been silenced. But while the public rallied behind her, the backlash came swiftly. Online trolls spewed hate-filled comments, accusing her of exaggerating the situation or playing the victim. Some even claimed she deserved what happened, twisting the narrative to fit their own biases. Death threats poured in, vile messages warning her to stay quiet or face consequences. For a moment, the weight of it all threatened to crush her. How could anyone defend what had happened? How could they twist something so clear-cut into something else entirely? Despite the fear gnawing at her, she refused to back down. Support poured in from unexpected places too. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers reached out, offering encouragement and solidarity. One message stood out, a note from a young woman, who wrote, "Seeing you stand tall makes me believe I can do the same. Thank you for not letting them break you." That simple sentence reminded her why this fight mattered. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone watching, hoping for change. The next few days were a whirlwind. News outlets clamored. For interviews, activists invited her to speak at rallies, and lawyers offered pro bono assistance to hold the officers accountable. At first, she hesitated. Taking on the system meant exposing herself to even more scrutiny, more danger. But then she thought about the people who didn't have the resources or connections to fight back. If she couldn't stand up for them, who would? With the help of her legal team, she filed a formal complaint against the officers involved in her wrongful arrest. The process was grueling. Hours upon hours were spent combing through police reports, reviewing body cam footage or lack thereof, and gathering evidence to prove misconduct. Every detail mattered: the tone of the officers' voices, the way they ignored her pleas, the unnecessary escalation. It was exhausting work, but she approached it with laser focus, determined to leave no stone unturned. As the investigation unfolded, cracks in the system began to show. Records revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior within the department. Complaints about racial profiling had piled up over the years, many dismissed without proper review. Officers accused of misconduct often faced little to no consequences, their actions brushed aside as isolated incidents rather than part of a larger problem. The more she dug, the clearer it became. Her case wasn't an anomaly, it was a symptom of something much bigger. Public pressure mounted. Politicians weighed in, calling for accountability and transparency. Community leaders organized protests, demanding reforms to prevent similar situations in the future. The department, caught in the spotlight, scrambled to respond. Statements were issued promising internal reviews and policy changes, but skepticism ran high. Promises meant nothing without action. Amid the chaos, she found moments of solace in small things. A warm cup of tea on a quiet morning. A phone call with her husband, his voice grounding her when doubt crept in. Late-night conversations with close friends who reminded her of her strength. These little anchors kept her steady when the waves of stress threatened to pull her under. Yet the emotional toll lingered. Sleep evaded her, stolen by nightmares of flashing lights and cold pavement. Anxiety shadowed her steps, making her hyper-aware of every glance, every interaction. She knew she couldn't carry this burden alone. Therapy sessions became a lifeline, helping her unpack the trauma and find ways to cope. Slowly, she learned to balance her passion for justice with self-care, recognizing that taking care of herself was just as important as fighting for others. Her resolve only grew stronger with time. She gave interviews, wrote op-eds, and spoke at conferences, sharing her story openly and honestly. In each appearance, she emphasized the importance of systemic change. "It's not enough to punish bad actors," she said during one televised panel. "We need to address the root causes, the biases, the policies, the culture that allows these injustices to happen in the first place." Her efforts sparked real momentum. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing police accountability, including measures for mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards, and stricter penalties for misconduct. Activists pushed for community policing initiatives, advocating for stronger relationships between officers and the neighborhoods they served. Schools incorporated lessons on racial bias and empathy into their curriculums, planting seeds of understanding in the next generation. Through it all, she remained humble, deflecting praise and redirecting attention to the broader movement. "I'm just one piece of a much larger puzzle," she told a reporter during a particularly heated week. Real change comes from collective action, from people standing together and saying, "Enough is enough," behind closed doors. However, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd endured. Tears flowed freely some nights, washing away the pain and frustration she couldn't show in public. She journaled her thoughts, pouring her heart onto paper as a way to process everything. Writing helped her see the silver lining, the hope that her struggle could inspire others to keep pushing for a better future. As weeks turned into months, the initial frenzy began to settle. The headlines shifted, focusing on other stories, other battles, but she knew the work wasn't done. Change took time, persistence, and patience. And though the road ahead remained long, she walked it with purpose, fueled by the belief that justice was worth fighting for, not just for herself, but for everyone counting on her to lead the way. In those quiet moments when the noise of the world faded and she could finally breathe, she reminded herself of one truth: this fight wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been wronged, everyone who had ever dared to dream of a fairer, kinder world. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, to speak out, to demand better, she knew progress was possible. The months that followed her arrest were a whirlwind of action, emotion, and relentless determination. The investigation into the officer's conduct uncovered layers of systemic issues within the police department. Records showed a troubling pattern: complaints about racial profiling, excessive force, and dismissive attitudes toward minority communities had been swept under the rug for years. Each new discovery fueled her resolve to push harder, to dig deeper, and to expose the truth no matter how uncomfortable it made people feel. She spent countless hours meeting with lawyers, activists, and community leaders, strategizing ways to hold the system accountable. Every conversation was intense, every decision weighed carefully. She knew this wasn't just about punishing a few bad apples. It was about dismantling the structures that allowed such behavior to thrive in the first place. It was about creating real, lasting change, but fighting the system came at a cost, one she hadn't fully anticipated. Death threats continued to pour in, each one more chilling than the last. Some warned her to drop the case, others promised retaliation against her family. Her husband urged her to hire security, and reluctantly she agreed. Having armed guards stationed outside her home felt surreal, like something out of a movie. Yet, it was a stark reminder of how dangerous speaking up could be. Her kids noticed the shift too. They were young enough not to understand everything, but old enough to sense the tension. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, her youngest asked why there were strange men standing by their gate. She hesitated, unsure of how much to share. Finally, she smiled gently and said, "They're here to keep us safe while Mommy works on something important." The answer seemed to satisfy them, though it left her heart heavy. How do you explain injustice to children who still believe the world is fair? Despite the risks, she pressed on. Her days became a blur of meetings, court appearances, and media interviews. She gave speeches at rallies, her voice steady even when her hands trembled. People listened not just because of who she was, but because of what she represented. To many, she was proof that standing up to power was possible. Even when the odds were stacked against you. One of the most powerful moments came during a televised town hall. The event was packed, with hundreds of people filling the auditorium and thousands more tuning in online. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. "I didn't ask for this," she began, her voice soft but firm. "No one asks to be pulled over, handcuffed, and treated like a criminal simply because of the color of their skin. But when it happens, and it happens far too often, we have two choices. We can stay silent, or we can use our voices to demand better. I choose to speak up." The crowd erupted in applause, but she held up a hand to quiet them. This isn't about revenge. It's not about pointing fingers or tearing anyone down. It's about building something stronger, something fairer. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I went through, or worse. Her words resonated deeply, sparking conversations across the country. Parents talked to their children about racism. Teachers incorporated discussions about equality and justice into their lesson plans. Even politicians, often hesitant to tackle controversial topics, began proposing reforms aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in law enforcement. Behind the scenes, her legal team worked tirelessly to build a solid case against the officers involved in her wrongful arrest. Evidence mounted: body cam footage, or lack thereof, witness testimonies, internal communications showing a lack of proper training. Each piece of the puzzle painted a clearer picture of negligence. And bias. When the disciplinary hearings finally began, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Media outlets camped outside, eager to report every detail. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The officers sat stoically, their expressions unreadable. Their lawyers argued that it was all a misunderstanding, that the situation had escalated due to miscommunication rather than malice, but she wasn't swayed. Miscommunication didn't explain the years of unchecked misconduct within the department. It didn't justify the fear and mistrust festering in communities of color. And it certainly didn't erase the trauma inflicted on innocent lives. In the end, justice prevailed, at least partially. Several officers were suspended without pay, and 2 were fired outright. The department announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory anti-bias training, stricter guidelines for traffic stops, and increased oversight. Critics argued that these measures didn't go far enough, but she saw them as steps in the right direction. Progress, she reminded herself, was rarely immediate or perfect. With the immediate battle won, she turned her attention to bigger goals. Inspired by grassroots activists, she helped draft legislation aimed at transforming policing nationwide. The bill included provisions for body cameras, independent review boards, and penalties for departments failing to address discriminatory practices. Getting it passed wouldn't be easy. Politics rarely was, but she refused to back down. Her efforts drew both praise and criticism. Supporters hailed her as a hero, someone brave enough to challenge the status quo. Detractors accused her of being divisive, of focusing too much on race instead of unity. But she brushed off the negativity, knowing that meaningful change always faced resistance. If everyone agrees with you, she told a colleague during a particularly tough week, then you're probably not pushing hard enough. Through it all, she leaned heavily on her support system. Friends checked in regularly, offering encouragement and distractions when needed. Her husband remained her rock, reminding her to take breaks and prioritize her mental health. Even her kids played a role, their laughter and hugs providing moments of light in an otherwise heavy journey, late at night when the house was quiet. And the weight of the day settled in, she often found herself reflecting on how far she'd come. From that cold pavement where she'd lain handcuffed to now standing before lawmakers advocating for reform, the transformation was remarkable. But it wasn't just hers, it belonged to everyone who had joined the fight, whether by signing petitions, attending protests, or simply having difficult conversations. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, her phone buzzed with a message from an old friend. "You've inspired so many people," it read. "Don't forget to take care of yourself, too." She smiled, feeling a lump rise in her throat. The road ahead was still long, filled with challenges she couldn't predict. But for the first time in a while, she felt hopeful. Hopeful that change was possible. Hopeful that her voice, along with countless others, could make a difference. As darkness fell and the stars began to twinkle above, she whispered a quiet promise to herself. No matter how hard things got, she would keep going. For her family, for her community, and for everyone counting on her to lead the way. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was everyone's, and together, they would move forward, step by step, toward a brighter future. The months that followed the disciplinary hearings were a whirlwind of activity, emotion, and hard-fought victories. The reforms announced by the police department were just the beginning, a small step toward addressing the deep-rooted issues plaguing law enforcement. But she knew better than anyone that announcements weren't enough. Real change required action, commitment, and accountability. And so, she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Her days became a blur of meetings with lawmakers, community leaders, and activists. Each conversation was intense, each decision weighed carefully. She understood that meaningful reform wouldn't happen overnight. It would take patience, persistence, and collaboration. Yet she also knew that momentum was crucial. If people stopped paying attention, if the pressure eased even slightly, the system would slip back into old habits. So she pushed forward, determined to keep the spotlight on the issue. One of her biggest priorities was drafting legislation aimed at increasing transparency within law enforcement. It wasn't just about punishing bad actors. It was about preventing misconduct in the first place. She worked closely with a team of lawyers and policy experts to craft a bill that included provisions for mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards, and stricter penalties for departments failing to address discriminatory practices. The goal was simple: create systems that held officers accountable, while fostering trust between communities and those sworn to protect them. But getting the bill passed wasn't easy. Politics is rarely straightforward, and this was no exception. Some lawmakers argued that the measures were too extreme, claiming they would hinder officers' ability to do their jobs effectively. Others worried about the cost of implementing such sweeping changes. Behind closed doors, lobbyists representing police unions pushed back aggressively, trying to water down the proposals or kill them altogether. She faced resistance head-on, using every tool at her disposal to make her case. She testified before Congress, sharing her story alongside others who had experienced similar injustices. She spoke passionately about the need for reform, her voice trembling with emotion as she described what it felt like to be treated like a criminal simply because of the color of her skin. "This isn't about targeting officers," she said during one particularly heated session. "It's about protecting everyone, officers included, from the consequences of unchecked bias and misconduct." Her testimony struck a chord. Lawmakers listened intently, some visibly moved by her words. Public support for the bill surged, with petitions circulating online and rallies organized across the country. Activists amplified her message, reminding people that justice delayed was justice denied. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Still, the fight wasn't without its challenges. Critics continued to push back, questioning whether the proposed reforms went too far or not far enough. Some accused her of playing politics, of using her platform for personal gain. The comments stung, especially when they came from people who didn't understand the depth of the problem. But she refused to let negativity derail her. Instead, she leaned on her support system, her family, friends, and colleagues who reminded her why she started this journey in the first place. Late nights became the norm as she pored over drafts of the bill, tweaking language and addressing concerns raised by both sides. Compromise was necessary, but she drew a firm line when it came to principles. Mandatory body cameras, non-negotiable. Independent oversight boards, essential. Stricter penalties for misconduct? Absolutely. These weren't just policy points, they were lifelines for communities desperate for change. When the final version of the bill finally made it to the floor for a vote, the tension was palpable. Supporters packed the gallery, holding their breath as lawmakers debated the merits of the proposal. Opponents voiced their objections, arguing that the reforms would place undue burdens on already overstretched departments. But supporters countered with data, stories, and unwavering conviction. "We can't afford to wait any longer," one senator declared. "The status quo isn't working for officers or for the people they serve." After hours of debate, the moment of truth arrived. The chamber fell silent as the clerk called for the vote. One by one, lawmakers cast their ballots. When the tally was announced, cheers erupted from the gallery. The bill had passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. It was a monumental victory, one that marked a turning point in the fight for police accountability. Outside the Capitol, crowds gathered to celebrate. News outlets hailed the legislation as a landmark achievement, a testament to the power of collective action. Social media lit up with messages of gratitude, many directed at her. People thanked her for refusing to give up, for standing tall when the odds seemed insurmountable. But she remained humble, deflecting praise and redirecting attention to the broader movement. "This isn't my win," she told reporters during a press conference. "It belongs to everyone who has ever demanded better, who has ever believed in the possibility of change." Behind the scenes, however, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Sitting alone in her office, she scrolled through photos and videos capturing the journey, the protests, the speeches, the late-night strategy sessions. Tears welled up in her eyes, not from sadness but from pride. Pride in how far they'd come. Pride in the resilience of those who refused to stay silent. pride in knowing that their efforts had paved the way for something bigger than themselves. Yet, even in victory, she knew the work wasn't done. Passing the bill was just the beginning. Implementation would be another battle entirely, requiring constant vigilance to ensure that promises translated into action. Departments resistant to change would need to be monitored closely. Training programs would need to be updated and enforced. Communities would need to be educated about their rights and empowered to hold officials accountable. To tackle these challenges, she launched a new initiative focused on grassroots advocacy. Partnering with local organizations, she traveled to towns and cities across the country, hosting workshops and town halls aimed at educating people about the reforms and encouraging them to get involved. She emphasized the importance of staying engaged, reminding audiences that true progress depended on sustained effort. Change doesn't happen because of one person or one moment, she said during one event. It happens because we all keep showing up, day after day, year after year. The response was overwhelming. People showed up in droves, eager to learn and contribute. Many shared their own experiences, adding their voices to the growing chorus demanding justice. For her, these interactions were some of the most rewarding parts of the journey. Hearing directly from those affected reinforced why she fought so hard, not for recognition or accolades, but for real, tangible improvements in people's lives. As weeks turned into months, the initial excitement began to settle. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy, though normal now carried a different meaning. Her kids grew accustomed to seeing their mom on TV or hearing strangers thank her in public. Her husband joked about becoming an expert at handling security details. Even her colleagues teased her about being a household name. Through it all, she stayed grounded, never losing sight of what mattered most. In quieter moments, she reflected on how much she'd grown, not just professionally, but personally. The experience had tested her in ways she never imagined, forcing her to confront fears, doubts, and insecurities. It had also shown her the strength she didn't know she possessed. She emerged stronger, more resilient, and more committed than ever to fighting for justice. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, her phone buzzed with a message from a young activist she'd met during one of her speaking tours. "You've inspired me to keep going," it read. "Thank you for showing us that change is possible." She smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. This was why she did what she did, not for headlines or applause, but for moments like this. Moments that reminded her that every voice mattered, every action counted, and every step forward brought them closer to a brighter future. As darkness fell and the stars began to twinkle above, she whispered a quiet promise to herself. No matter how hard things got, she would keep showing up. For her family, for her community, and for everyone, counting on her to lead the way. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was everyone's, and together, they would move forward, step by step, toward a world where fairness and equality weren't just ideals, but realities. Years had passed since that fateful night when her life changed forever. The memory of lying on the cold pavement, handcuffed and humiliated, still lingered in the back of her mind. But it wasn't just a painful reminder, it was also a source of strength. That moment had ignited something inside her, a fire that refused to burn out. It pushed her to fight harder, speak louder, and dream bigger than she ever thought possible. By now, the reforms she helped champion had begun to take root. Police departments across the country adopted mandatory body cameras, giving citizens a layer of protection they'd never had before. Independent oversight boards were established, ensuring that complaints against officers were investigated thoroughly and fairly. Training programs focused on bias and de-escalation became standard practice, helping officers better understand the communities they served. These changes didn't solve everything. There was still so much work to be done, but they marked progress. Real, tangible progress. Her role evolved too. She no longer spent her days solely in courtrooms or legislative chambers. Instead, she traveled extensively, visiting schools, community centers, and grassroots organizations. Her mission was simple: to inspire others to keep pushing for change. Everywhere she went, people greeted her with open arms, eager to hear her story and learn from her experiences. One of her favorite stops was a small town in the Midwest. The community there had been hit hard by years of neglect and systemic inequality. Crime rates were high, trust in law enforcement was low, and hope felt like a distant concept. But when she arrived, she found a group of determined residents, ready to turn things around. They gathered in a modest community center, filling folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. Some brought notebooks. Others carried phones to record her talk. Their faces told stories of struggle, resilience, and determination. She started her presentation with a question: how many of you have ever felt powerless? Hands shot up immediately, almost every person in the room raising theirs. She nodded knowingly, then shared her own experience: the traffic stop, the arrest, the fear and frustration that came with realizing how broken the system truly was. I tell you this not because I want sympathy, she said, her voice steady but warm. I tell you this because I want you to know that feeling powerless doesn't mean you are. You have power within you even if it doesn't feel like it. Right now? The room fell silent, everyone hanging on to her words. She went on to explain how small actions could lead to big changes. Writing letters to elected officials, attending town hall meetings, organizing neighborhood cleanups. These might seem insignificant on their own, but together they created momentum. Change isn't about one grand gesture, she emphasized. It's about showing up consistently, even when it feels like nothing is happening, because trust me, something is happening. Every step matters. Afterward, people lined up to thank her, some shaking her hand, others hugging her tightly. One elderly woman approached her with tears in her eyes. You've given us hope, she said softly. We needed that more than anything. Those words stayed with her long after she left the town, a reminder of why she kept doing what she did. Back home, her life settled into a rhythm of sorts. She continued working as a lawyer, taking on cases that aligned with her passion for justice. Her kids were older now, old enough to grasp the weight of what she'd accomplished. They often asked questions about her work, curious about the protests they saw on TV or the speeches they heard online. She answered honestly, explaining the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's scary. Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid, she told them once. It means you do it anyway. Her husband remained her anchor, supporting her through the ups and downs. There were moments when the stress threatened to overwhelm her: the late nights, the endless phone calls, the constant pressure to stay ahead of critics. But he reminded her to breathe, to rest, to celebrate victories along the way. Together, they built a life rooted in purpose and love, a foundation strong enough to weather whatever storms came their way. As time went on, she began writing a memoir, pouring her heart into its pages. It wasn't just her story, it was a reflection of the countless others who had inspired her along the way. From activists marching in the streets to mothers grieving the loss of their children, each voice shaped her journey in profound ways. She dedicated the book to them, promising to donate all proceeds to organizations fighting for racial justice and police reform. The release of the memoir brought another wave of attention. Talk shows invited her to share her insights, universities offered honorary degrees, and nonprofits sought her guidance. While flattered, she remained grounded, always redirecting focus to the broader movement. This isn't about me, she'd say over and over again. It's about all of us working together to create a better future. Despite the accolades, she never lost sight of where she came from or where she wanted to go. She knew the road ahead would continue to be challenging. New issues would arise, new battles would need to be fought. But she faced them with optimism, believing deeply in the power of collective action. Progress might be slow, but it was inevitable. As long as people refused to give up, on quiet evenings, she sometimes sat alone on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. Those moments gave her time to reflect, to process everything she'd been through and everything still left to do. Sometimes sadness crept in, memories of that night flooding back. But more often than not, she felt gratitude for her family, for her health, for the privilege of being able to make a difference. One evening, as she flipped through old photos, she paused at one taken shortly after the incident. In it, she stood surrounded by supporters at a rally, her face tired but resolute. She remembered how heavy the burden had felt back then, how uncertain the future seemed. Yet here she was, years later, still standing tall, still fighting. That realization filled her with a sense of peace. She couldn't control everything. She couldn't erase racism or injustice overnight, but she could control how she responded. And she chose to respond with courage, compassion, and unwavering determination. As darkness enveloped the world outside, she leaned back in her chair, letting the cool night air wash over her. Stars blinked into existence above, tiny pinpricks of light dotting an endless expanse. For a moment she felt small, not insignificant, but connected to something larger than herself, a movement, a legacy, a promise to future generations that they deserved better. And so she whispered a vow to the night sky, a pledge to herself and to the world. I won't stop. Not until we've built a system that treats everyone equally. Not until fairness isn't just a dream, but a reality. With that, she rose from her chair, stepped back inside, and prepared for whatever tomorrow might bring. The fight wasn't over, but neither was she.